So, what is social fascism? Social fascism is when civilians are victimized through fascistic tendencies. Fascistic tendencies that are used by corrupt right-wing or extreme conservative actors. So normal fascism is when you have full-blown right-wing version of authoritarianism that has a lot of like bigotry and racism involved in it. You have neo-fascism is where I think that's kind of when governments commit to fascistic tendencies, but they still function within democracy. But social fascism is like a modern trend where bad faith actors online, people spreading misinformation or disinformation, which is basically covered. It's either called selective populists or selective populism or controlled mass media. Um, so so social fascism is when civilians are victimized through fascistic tendencies. Like if they fall for propaganda and disinformation, they're a victim of selective populism or they're a victim of controlled mass media. Um, if they are falling for anti immigrant propaganda and disinformation, like portraying all immigrants as criminals, then they'd be a victim of um, fear of difference, which is governments doing racist type stuff. Um, it's when either governments take the rights away of the LGBT. So, weaponry machismo is when governments take the rights away from the LGBTQ, or it's when political commentators that work for the government basically demonize the LGBTQ, and where they go into what I call the weaponization of tradition and the weaponization of religion, where they prey on things like anti-abortion sentiment and anti-LGBTQ sentiment to manipulate religious people for votes. So that's kind of like weaponry machismo is when right-wing fascist, right-wing authoritarian type governments either target the LGBTQ and take their rights away, or whether they feed into anti-LGBTQ sentiment or pro-lifeism or whatever to manipulate religious people for votes, and that is the weaponization of religion and the weaponization of tradition. Weaponization of tradition is when they intentionally, like, corrupt right-wing governments don't want to do anything to improve society, so they use like the weaponization of tradition to make sure that things don't change and rights don't improve. They might do this by using or labeling, whenever the government does something to teach ethics or morality, they call it the nanny state. They pretend they advocate for limited government when they secretly want to attack education. That leads into rejection of modernism or disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Um, like I would cover it in my fascistic tendencies, like anti-intellectualism or intellectual fascism. Because under fascist psychology, fascists don't like an educated populace because an educated populace is harder to control and harder to manipulate. If you've fallen for that, if you've fallen for like anti-wokeism, if you've gone to the point where you think like fascism is left-wing when it's historically and inherently a right-wing thing, if you fall for war as a woman propaganda and disinformation, then you'd be a victim of newspeak, or what I call the bastardization of words, where either they bastardize the words themselves or they do political tricks to manipulate people to make it out as if fascism doesn't exist. Where within social fascism, it's literally when governments and corrupt political commentators use fascistic tendencies to manipulate and to control the populace. Denying psychology and mental health, which the right wing is doing, would be rejection of modernism. Yeah, so that's kind of like a small bit, like a bit of what I've created called social fascism, which is about corrupt governments or corrupt political commentators using fascistic tendencies to manipulate and to control the populace. So it's and in my fascistic tendencies, I either call it the extra points of fascism or the infinite points of social fascism, or uh, corruption tendencies, or right wing or conservative corruption tendencies. And I basically detail every single way in which governments are corrupt and the tactics that they do. Um, what else can I go into? So I want to do that as kind of like the first part. So just in case I stumble and I can't think of anything to go into. So 3, 2, 1. That's end of part 1. So part 2. Other elements of it is when right-wing propaganda and disinformation, like anti-wokeism, starts to infect civilian populace, hence, social fascism or social corruption or social manipulation or social neglect. It's like when fascistic terminology, because woke, like the actual definition, or what I would say the definition of woke is, it means to um, learn or to be informed about politics. Woke as in to be awakened to the truth, as in to know facts. So if woke means to learn, anti-woke means to be against learning. Like I've heard political commentators say, "Oh, I don't see the value in philosophy as much as other people. I see the value. I do see the value. I see the value in empiricism, when empiricism is philosophy. So that's kind of like anti-intellectual or intellectual fascism. They intentionally want to make you ignorant and stupid. It's like denying psychology, like saying mental health doesn't exist, like ADHD or depression. Um, Elements of social fascism is when they're utilizing fascistic newspeak or bastardization terminology within soap operas and things like that. They put them in movies, like it appeared in Deadpool. Um, so it's like these fascistic tendencies and this fascistic propaganda is infecting society. So that'd be an element of social fascism. There's the weaponization of comedy and comedians. Either it's when they get comedians on right-wing shows to use them to platform right-wing talking points like anti-wokeism. But a lot of the times it's actually comedians basically jump on modern trends, and sometimes these in the modern day, since I've been following politics since 2020. They're jumping on these trends that are started by far right wing propagandists. Um, the only thing I've seen where I've identified that there's left wing fascism is like the fake progressives, like they pretend as if they're progressive, but all they do is attack the Democrats or Labour or Green Party, um, or enlightened centrists or fake centrists. That's when you have political commentators pretending as if they're liberal, but all they do is far right wing propaganda and talking points. Disdain for all that is good, like thinking psychology is bad, that ethics is bad, anti discrimination is bad, teaching that racism is bad, like they pretend that these things that are good are actually bad. Um, the bastardization of all that is good, denying climate change, saying like multiculturalism is bad, all this kind of stuff. I'm doing this without looking it up, without reading it. I'm trying to remember other corruption tendencies or manipulative tendencies. Um, So I've created over 250 plus of different tactics that governments use and different political commentators use. There would be like fascistic dictators putting their name on everything. Renaming airports and things like that. That's something they do in the modern day. The government's, taking the rights away from the LGBTQ, from trans people. Should I do that as end of part 2? I think I will. So anyway, that's a little bit of what I call social fascism. Like I said, it's fascism originally, and by definition is right wing, because it's basically a form of authoritarianism that includes LGBTQ bigotry and like racism and white supremacy, like hyper nationalism, or the weaponization of hyper nationalism. So that's kind of like social fascism, which is when, like I was going to say, is that to remind that social fascism is when you have civilians manipulated through right-wing corruption tendencies or social corruption tendencies, originally known as the fascist as the 14 points of fascism, which there's 2 different versions. But anyway, fascism, you've always got to remember the rules is that it's inherently right-wing, and it's when the government does stuff. It's not when civilians do random stuff. Like people in colleges and universities or in schools or the medical profession, they don't count. They don't inherently count as the government. Fascism. When you have proper fascism, it's when corrupt right-wing governments do stuff, do corrupt stuff, to manipulate and control the populace. And now I'm just babbling, so the video's going to end there. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Share the video, hype the video, but most importantly, like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thank you.